Imagine a tower so tall that the clouds passed halfway up its height, a structure so massive that you would need 45 minutes just to walk around its base. And now imagine that it was built more than 4,000 years ago, without cranes, without steel, without concrete, just mud, fire, and the obsession of an entire humanity. The Tower of Babel is not a legend, it existed, and the way it was built challenges everything you think you know about the ancient world. But here is the mystery that no one tells you. How do you raise a 90-meter-high artificial mountain using only mud and straw? How to transport millions of bricks without wheels, without trained pack animals, without paved roads? And more importantly, why did an entire civilization decide they needed to touch the sky? The answer involves technology so ingenious that modern engineers still study it today, and a plan so ambitious that it forced God to personally come down to see what humanity was doing. To understand how the Tower of Babel was built, you first need to understand where it was built. And the place could not be more unlikely. The plain of Shinar, what we now call southern Iraq, is one of the most hostile terrains on the planet for monumental construction. There is no stone. There is no wood in significant quantities. What exists is 120-degree heat in the summer, devastating floods in the winter, and endless miles of swamps and desert. When the Egyptians wanted to build the pyramids, they had Tura limestone and Aswan granite. When the Greeks erected the Parthenon, they had marble from Mount Pentelicus. But the builders of Babel, they looked at that empty plain and saw mud, and that is exactly what they used. Genesis 11:3 records the exact moment of this decision. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. It sounds simple, but this single sentence hides a technological revolution that changed human history. You see, before Babel, bricks existed, but they were sun-dried mud bricks. You mixed clay with straw, molded them in forms, let them dry for a few weeks, and you had a reasonable building block. The problem? Sun-dried bricks dissolve. A heavy rain, a flood, and your construction turns back into mud. To build something permanent, something that would defy time and touch the sky, you needed something stronger. And here enters the innovation that made Babel possible: the burnt brick. The process seems simple, but it required impressive technical control. First, you collected clay from the beds of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a specific clay with the right proportion of silt and minerals. Too much clay, and the brick cracks in the kiln. Too much sand, and it disintegrates under pressure. Then you mix this clay with chopped straw. Not just any straw, but straw of a specific length that created a network of fibers inside the mud. This network prevented cracking during drying and gave the brick internal structure. Then came the molding. Each brick was pressed into standardized wooden forms. And here is a detail that archaeologists discovered. The bricks of Babel had precise dimensions, not approximate, precise. We are talking about variations of less than half a centimeter in bricks made by hand 4,000 years ago. This means there was a quality control system. Someone was checking every mold, every brick, rejecting those that didn't pass the standard. In an age where most of humanity still lived in tents, the builders of Babel had already developed standardized industrial production, but the true secret was in the kiln. Sun-dried bricks are ready in weeks. Burnt bricks need kilns that reach 900 to 1,100 degrees Celsius and maintain that temperature for days. We are talking about technology that Europe would only fully master thousands of years later. The kilns of Babel were massive structures, fed continuously with dried reeds, straw, and any available fuel. The heat transformed the clay into ceramic. It literally fused the minerals and created a material that does not dissolve in water, does not crack with temperature changes, and can support the weight of an artificial mountain on top of it. Now do the math with me. The Tower of Babel, based on biblical descriptions, and the ruins of the Etemenanki ziggurat in Babylon, which many scholars believe to be the reconstruction or continuation of the original project, had a base of approximately 90 meters by 90 meters, the height at least 90 meters, possibly more. To build something of these dimensions with bricks, you need approximately 36 million bricks. That's right, 36 million individual bricks, each molded by hand, each fired in a kiln for days, each transported and positioned manually. If you could produce 1,000 bricks a day, which would already be an impressive industrial operation, it would take almost 100 years just to manufacture the bricks, not counting transportation, construction, bitumen, logistics. The math simply doesn't add up, unless you mobilize an entire civilization. And that is exactly what the biblical text describes. Genesis 11:1 opens the narrative with a crucial piece of information. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. There were no nations, there were no communication barriers. The whole of humanity, and at this point in the biblical story, we are talking about all the generations descending from Noah, operated as a single unified civilization. Think about what that means for a construction project. Without language barriers, you can coordinate thousands of workers with precise instructions. Without national divisions, you can mobilize resources from entire regions without diplomatic negotiation. Without tribal conflicts, you can dedicate the entire productive force of humanity to a single goal. The builders of Babel did not have technology superior to ours. They had something that perhaps has never existed again in history: total and absolute human cooperation. If you are impressed by the scale of this cooperation, comment "United Humanity," because what comes next shows how this unity was transformed into an unprecedented construction machine. Brick production was decentralized. Instead of a single manufacturing center, archaeologists have found evidence of dozens, possibly hundreds of kilns scattered across the plain of Shinar. Every community, every clan, every family had its quota of bricks to produce. It was a logistical operation that rivaled any modern war effort. Think of the industrial mobilization of World War II, where entire countries converted their economies for military production. Babel did something similar, but instead of tanks and planes, it produced bricks and bitumen. And speaking of bitumen, the second material mentioned in Genesis 11:3 is just as important as the brick, and bitumen for mortar. Bitumen is natural petroleum, that thick black liquid that bubbles up from the ground in certain regions of the Middle East. Today, we use it for asphalt and waterproofing. 4,000 years ago, it was the super material that turned impossible constructions into reality. The problem with brick, even burnt brick, is that it needs something to stick together. The Egyptians used gypsum mortar. The Romans developed concrete, but the Mesopotamians discovered something better. Bitumen was waterproof, flexible, and incredibly strong as an adhesive. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited the ruins of Babylon in the 5th century BC, was obsessed with this material. He describes how bitumen was extracted from natural wells in the city of Is, about 200 kilometers upstream, and transported in boats down the Euphrates. But here is the technical detail that impresses modern engineers. Bitumen was not used in every layer. If you analyze the remains of Mesopotamian ziggurats, and archaeologists have done exactly that, you find a specific pattern. Layers of bricks joined with common mortar, interrupted at certain heights by a complete layer of bricks sealed with bitumen. It was a layered waterproofing system. The bitumen layers acted as barriers against the moisture rising from the ground and the rain penetrating from above. Without this system, the tower would have dissolved from the inside out within a few decades. Someone 4,000 years ago understood waterproofing engineering at a level that many modern builders ignore. Now imagine the construction site. You are standing on the plain of Shinar under a 113-degree sun. In front of you, a structure that already surpasses anything you have ever seen, and it is still growing. The noise is deafening. Thousands of workers shouting instructions, singing work songs, dragging sleds loaded with bricks. The smell is a mixture of heated bitumen, acrid and penetrating like fresh asphalt, with the sweat of thousands of bodies working under the desert sun. Kilns burn day and night nearby, casting columns of smoke that you can see for miles. And somewhere in the middle of this organized chaos, specialized teams are doing something that seems impossible, carrying 33-pound bricks, one by one, to the top of a structure that is already the height of a 20-story building. How do you transport millions of bricks to the top of a 90-meter tower? This is the question that separates amateur theories from real engineering, and the answer reveals a sophistication that will surprise you. The most likely method, based on archaeological evidence from other ziggurats and cuneiform texts describing construction techniques, involved a system of spiral ramps. Imagine a ramp that starts at ground level and rises, circling the tower to the top. Not a straight ramp. That would require a support structure larger than the tower itself, but a ramp that rests on the construction itself, spiraling up like a mountain road. With each level completed, the ramp was extended. Workers climbed carrying bricks, descended empty-handed, and repeated. An infinite cycle of human labor that lasted from sunrise to sunset every day for decades. But the ramps created another problem. Did every brick need to be carried individually? That would be too inefficient, even with thousands of workers. Records of later Mesopotamian constructions, and there is no reason to believe techniques were much different in Babel, describe the use of wooden sleds. Not sleds with wheels. The wheel existed, but it was not efficient on packed earth ramps. Sleds that slid over the surface, pulled by teams of men or pushed from behind. Each sled carried dozens of bricks. The ramp was constantly wetted to reduce friction. Dedicated teams threw water in front of the sleds. The sound must have been constant, the dragging of wood on wet earth, the shouts of coordination, the thud of bricks being unloaded. If this level of organization impresses you, leave a like now, because what comes next is even more surprising. You solved the problem of horizontal transport. But what about vertical transport to the upper levels? Here enters a technology that many people do not associate with the ancient world. Systems of ropes and pulleys. The Mesopotamians knew the pulley, not the compound pulley that multiplies force, that would come later with the Greeks, but the simple pulley that changes the direction of force. With a system of ropes passing through pulleys at the top of the construction, you could hoist baskets of bricks using gravity in your favor. Workers on the ground pulled the rope down. The basket went up. It was slower than the ramps for large volumes, but essential for the final stages of construction, where ramps became impractical. But structural engineering is where the Tower of Babel truly shines. Think of the problem. You are stacking millions of bricks, one on top of the other, up to 90 meters high. The accumulated weight at the base is astronomical. The bricks at the bottom of the tower are literally supporting millions of pounds of pressure. If you built a solid tower, brick upon brick to the top, it would collapse. Its own weight would crush the lower layers. The tower would sink into the swampy Mesopotamian soil like a ship sinking in quicksand. The solution? The ziggurats were not solid. Archaeologists who excavated Mesopotamian ziggurats, including the remains of what may have been the base of the Tower of Babel, discovered something fascinating. The interior is not a solid mass of bricks. It is a complex structure of chambers, corridors, and empty spaces, all calculated to distribute weight and reduce the total mass. It was advanced structural architecture. The builders understood, perhaps intuitively, perhaps through trial and error over generations, that a hollow structure, if designed correctly, can be stronger than a solid structure. Think of a human bone. It is not solid. It is a porous structure that maximizes strength while minimizing weight. The ziggurats used the same principle. And there was another benefit: ventilation. A solid mass of mud bricks retains moisture. Water rises by capillary action from the soil, gets trapped inside, and eventually causes cracking and deterioration from the inside out. But with internal chambers and ventilation channels, air circulated, moisture evaporated, the structure breathed. Cuneiform texts describe air holes deliberately built into ziggurats, channels that cross the structure from side to side. They were not accidents or defects. They were deliberate engineering. Now let's talk about something few consider: the foundation. You cannot simply start stacking bricks on the ground and expect a 90-meter tower to stay standing, especially not on the alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, where the soil is basically compacted mud over more mud. The weight of a structure like the Tower of Babel, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of tons, would sink into the ground like an anchor in the ocean, unless you prepare the foundation. The builders of Babel used a technique called a floating platform. First, they excavated until they found a firmer layer of soil. Then, they covered this area with woven reed mats, layers upon layers of compacted vegetation that distributed the weight evenly. Over the mats came a massive layer of burnt bricks, not for the tower itself, but as a foundation. This layer was waterproofed with bitumen on all sides, creating a base that did not absorb water from the soil. Only then did the actual construction begin. And here is the detail that shows the scale of these builders' thinking. The foundation of the Tower of Babel likely took years to complete, years of intensive labor before a single brick of the tower itself was placed. They were not building for their generation. They were building for eternity. But there was a problem that no engineering could completely solve: the weight of the mud itself. Burnt brick is strong, but it is not stone. Each layer of bricks compresses slightly under the weight of the layers above. In a low building, this is irrelevant. In a 90-meter tower, the accumulated compression can cause deformations, cracks, and eventually collapse. The Mesopotamian solution was elegant: reed layers, every certain number of rows of bricks. The patterns vary, but usually between 5 and 13 rows. The builders inserted a complete layer of woven reed mats, sometimes soaked in bitumen. These layers functioned like expansion joints. They absorbed the compression, distributed stresses, and allowed different sections of the tower to move slightly without transmitting stress to the entire structure. It was exactly the same principle that modern engineers use in skyscrapers, only implemented 4,000 years ago with marsh materials. Now imagine you are one of the workers. You wake up before dawn. The air is still cool, one of the few hours of the day when the heat is not unbearable. You eat a simple meal: barley bread, maybe some dates, water. Then you walk to the construction site. The tower already dominates the horizon, larger than anything your parents or grandparents ever saw. You climbed this tower yesterday, you will climb it again today and tomorrow, and for every day you can imagine. Your specific job depends on your skill. Maybe you are a carrier, the most brutal job, climbing ramps with bricks on your back until your muscles scream. Maybe you are a molder, spending the entire day pressing clay into molds until your hands bleed. Maybe you are a burner, feeding kilns that can never go out, breathing smoke until your lungs burn. Or maybe, if you have special skill, you are a layer. The men who stand at the top, positioning each brick with millimeter precision, applying hot bitumen with their hands, literally building the highest point of human civilization. The work doesn't stop at noon. It doesn't stop when it rains. It doesn't stop when someone falls. And people fall. In a construction of this scale, with this technology, accidents are inevitable. There are no records of how many died building the Tower of Babel. But if we compare it with similar projects, the pyramids, the later ziggurats, We are talking about hundreds, possibly thousands of deaths over the decades of construction. Every meter of height cost blood, and yet they continued. Why? Genesis 11:4 reveals the motivation. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." It wasn't just pride, it was fear. Post-flood humanity had a traumatic collective memory. Their ancestors had seen the world destroyed by water. The entire civilization, except for 8 people, had been erased. And the God who did it once could do it again. The Tower of Babel was not just a monument to the human ego. It was an insurance policy against extinction, a structure so high that no flood could reach it, a city so strong that no divine judgment could destroy it. If you understand this deep fear that motivated the builders, comment, "I understand." Because what God did in response and how he did it reveals something about human nature that remains true to this day. And here is the twist that changes everything. The Tower of Babel was not destroyed by a lightning bolt. It didn't collapse in an earthquake. It wasn't burned by fire from heaven. Genesis 11:5-7 describes something much more surgical. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." God did not destroy the tower. He destroyed something much more fundamental, the capacity for cooperation. Think of the practical implications. You are a layer at the top of the tower. Your job depends on constant communication with the carriers who bring material, with the mixers who prepare the bitumen, with the supervisors who coordinate the rhythm. Suddenly, no one understands anyone. You shout more bricks, and the person next to you looks at you without comprehension. The carrier who was coming up stops with an expression of total confusion. The words coming out of your mouth make no sense to him. The supervisor tries to give orders, and each worker interprets something different. In minutes, the most organized construction site in human history turns into absolute chaos. It was not a physical attack, it was a virus in communication, and it was infinitely more effective than any earthquake. Imagine the terror of that moment. You spent years, perhaps your entire life, working on this project. You knew every person around you by name. You shared meals, sang the same work songs, buried together the companions who fell from the ramps. And suddenly, these people became strangers. Not foreigners who speak a different language that you can eventually learn. Strangers whose sounds do not connect to any meaning in your brain. The feeling must have been one of collective madness. Some probably thought they had gone crazy individually until they realized everyone around them was experiencing the same thing. Others must have tried desperately to communicate through gestures, drawings, anything. But the construction of a 90-meter tower cannot be coordinated by mime. And here is the detail that many preachers ignore. The confusion of languages was not uniform. If every person had started speaking a completely unique language, humanity would have fragmented into millions of isolated individuals. That is not what happened. Genesis 11:8 indicates that groups were formed. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth. Groups, plural, people who could still understand each other but not the other groups. What God created was not a cacophony of individual voices. He created linguistic families, communities that shared a new common language, tribes that could cooperate internally but not externally. Jewish tradition, preserved in texts like the Book of Jubilees and other rabbinic sources, suggests that 70 languages emerged that day. 70! the number that represents totality in Hebrew scripture, 70 nations, 70 different destinies for a humanity that had been one. Modern linguists identify between 6,000 and 7,000 distinct languages in the world today. All of them, according to the biblical narrative, descend from those original 70. Branches of branches of branches, like a tree that grows for 4,000 years from 70 seeds planted in a single day on the plain of Shinar. But what happened immediately after the confusion? The biblical text is too concise to satisfy our curiosity. It simply says they stopped building the city and scattered. However, archaeology and logic allow us to reconstruct the scene. First, there must have been conflict. When communication collapses, distrust arises instantly. That group over there speaking strange sounds. What are they planning? Those men with tools you no longer understand. Are they a threat? Paranoia must have spread like wildfire. Then came the practical separation. You cannot live alongside people with whom you cannot negotiate, resolve disputes, or simply ask for a glass of water. Linguistic groups naturally began to coalesce. Families who found they still understood each other joined together. Clans formed around shared languages. And then, inevitably, these clans began to move away from each other, not by direct divine command, but by the practical impossibility of coexistence without communication. The city that had been the center of the world emptied. Not all at once. This took months, perhaps years, but family by family, group by group, the population of Babel migrated. Some went north, toward the mountains of Anatolia. Others went south, toward the Persian Gulf and beyond. Groups went east, crossing the Iranian plateau toward the Indian subcontinent. And still others marched west, crossing the Levant toward Africa and Europe. And the tower? The structure itself was not destroyed. It was simply abandoned. Think about it. Millions of bricks, decades of labor, the largest construction ever attempted by humanity, left behind as a monument to failure. Without maintenance, erosion began immediately. The rain, which the layered bitumen waterproofing system had been designed to combat, now penetrated without resistance. Drainage channels clogged with no one to clear them. Cracks appeared, and no one repaired them. The bitumen, exposed to the relentless Mesopotamian sun, without the protection of new layers, began to dry out and crack. The bricks in the outer layers loosened and fell. The internal chambers, designed for ventilation, now allowed animals to nest, plants to grow in the crevices, and water to accumulate in puddles that never dried. The tower that was supposed to touch the heavens began its slow return to the earth from which it had been molded. Generations later, travelers could still see the remains. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, more than 1,500 years after the events of Genesis 11, describes the Etemenanki, a ziggurat in Babylon that he believed was the original tower, or a reconstruction of it. He speaks of an 8-story structure, approximately 90 meters high, in the center of a sacred complex. But even in Herodotus's time, the ziggurat had been destroyed and rebuilt several times. Nebuchadnezzar II, the king who conquered Jerusalem and took the Jews into exile, boasted in inscriptions of having restored the tower to rival the heavens. This is an irony that few realize. The same king who destroyed Solomon's temple tried to rebuild the Tower of Babel. The instrument of divine judgment against Judah dedicated immense resources to re-erect the monument of the original human rebellion. And just like the original tower, this reconstruction also did not last. Alexander the Great planned to restore it once more when he died in Babylon in 323 BC. His generals abandoned the project. The tower continued to deteriorate. Today, all that remains is a depression in the ground, a rectangular hole approximately 90 meters on each side at the archaeological site of Babylon in modern-day Iraq. The German archaeologists who excavated the site in the early 20th century found foundations, brick fragments with cuneiform inscriptions, and evidence of multiple construction phases. But the tower itself, if it was ever completed, has completely disappeared. Millions of bricks dissolved by rain or stolen over the millennia to build other structures. Human arrogance literally recycled into common houses. If this image of total ruin impacts you, leave a like. Because now we are going to examine something even deeper, the permanent consequences of that day in Babel. The confusion of languages was not just a historical event. It was a fundamental shift in the human condition. Before Babel, humanity was one. After Babel, humanity became many. And this fragmentation shaped absolutely everything that came after. Think of the wars in human history. How many of them began with misunderstandings? How many escalated because the two sides literally could not communicate? How many could have been avoided if humanity still spoke a single language? The language barrier does not just cause inconvenience, it causes distrust. It causes dehumanization. It is much easier to kill someone whose words you do not understand, because deep in your brain, that person seems less human. And it's not just wars. Linguistic fragmentation created cultural fragmentation. Each group that left Babel took with them memories of the world before the flood, but these memories, passed down in different languages, evolved in different ways. The creation story became dozens of creation myths. The flood story became hundreds of variations in cultures around the world. The memory of Babel itself became legends of towers that challenged the gods in civilizations that never saw Mesopotamia. The Sumerians told the story of Enmerkar, a king who asked the gods to restore the age when the whole universe, the people in unison, spoke to Enlil in a single language. The Greeks had the myth of the Aloadai, giants who piled mountains to attack Olympus and were punished by the gods. The Mayans preserved legends of ancestors who spoke a single language before being divided. Cultures separated by oceans with no possible contact between them, preserving echoes of the same ancestral memory. How do you explain this without a real historical event that originated them? But here is the question few people ask. Was the punishment of Babel permanent? Is humanity condemned forever to linguistic fragmentation? The biblical text suggests not, and the evidence is in an event that happened approximately 2,000 years after Babel in a city called Jerusalem during a festival called Pentecost. Acts chapter 2 describes the moment when the Holy Spirit descended upon the disciples of Jesus, and the first supernatural sign was not healing, was not prophecy, was not power over demons. It was language, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Jews from every nation were in Jerusalem for the feast. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, inhabitants of Mesopotamia, from the very region of Babel, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya, visitors from Rome, Cretans and Arabs, a list that represents practically the entire known world. And each of them heard the disciples speaking in their own language, not an incomprehensible heavenly language, their mother tongues, the languages in which they had grown up, in which they dreamed, in which they prayed. The confusion of Babel was temporarily reversed, not through human engineering or forced cooperation, but through the Spirit of God, communicating the message of the gospel through all the barriers he himself had created centuries before. If you are noticing the connection between these two events, comment Babel and Pentecost. Because this is not a coincidence, it is a pattern. Think of the symmetry. At Babel, humanity united to build a tower that would reach the heavens, and God came down to confuse their languages. At Pentecost, God came down upon ordinary men, and through them, all languages were unified in the understanding of a single message. Babel was judgment. Pentecost was redemption. Babel scattered humanity. Pentecost began to gather it again, not around a construction project, but around a person. Babel was about reaching God through human effort. Pentecost was about God reaching humanity through grace. But Pentecost did not eliminate languages. The disciples did not start speaking a single universal language. Language barriers remained, and remain to this day. The difference is that now these barriers can be crossed, not destroyed, but transcended. The gospel was translated, first into Greek, the lingua franca of the Mediterranean world, then into Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, then into Gothic, Slavic, Germanic, Arabic, Chinese, Quechua, Swahili, and eventually into practically every language on earth. The Bible is the most translated book in human history, completely or partially available in more than 3,000 languages, reaching a percentage of the world's population that no other text has ever reached. It is as if God's message is systematically undoing the work of Babel, not by eliminating languages, but by using each of them as a channel for the same truth. And this leads us back to the tower, to the physical structure that humanity tried to build to reach the divine through bricks and bitumen. Because there is a final irony that closes the circle of this story. The builders of Babel wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their work to endure. And for 4,000 years we have remembered them, not as heroes, but as an example. Not for the greatness of their tower, but for the greatness of their failure. The Tower of Babel has become a universal symbol, and not just for Bible readers. In many languages, the word Babel means confusion, incomprehensible noise. In English, Babel means to talk nonsensically. The very name of the city became synonymous with what happened there. Humanity wanted to make a name for itself, and it did, but not the name it intended. It wanted to be remembered for reaching the heavens, and it is remembered for not even being able to understand itself. And yet, the story of Babel does not end with ruins and mockery. Because that plain in Mesopotamia was not just the stage for a failure, it was the cradle of something humanity had not yet experienced: diversity. Before Babel, there was uniformity, one language, one culture, one collective project. After Babel, there were 70 different paths, 70 ways of seeing the world, 70 traditions that would develop in ways no one could predict. Think of what humanity created after scattering. The groups that went to Egypt developed hieroglyphic writing, built pyramids that still defy our understanding, mapped the stars with precision that would only be matched millennia later. Those who went to the Indus Valley created cities with sanitation systems that Europe would not have until the 19th century. Those who crossed into the Americas developed astronomical calendars, cultivated corn from a wild grass, built floating cities on lakes. None of this would have happened if humanity had remained united at Babel. A single culture, however advanced, follows a single path. It explores a single direction. It solves problems in a single way. But 70 cultures explore 70 directions simultaneously. They compete, they influence each other, they copy each other, they surpass each other. The fragmentation of Babel was not just punishment. It was a multiplication of possibilities. The Chinese invented gunpowder and used it for fireworks. The Europeans adapted it for firearms that transformed warfare. The Arabs preserved and expanded the Greek knowledge that Europe had forgotten. The Indians developed the concept of zero that revolutionized world mathematics. The Polynesians navigated the Pacific using only stars and currents, colonizing islands separated by thousands of miles of empty ocean. Each culture, isolated by the linguistic barriers of Babel, developed its own geniuses that would later be shared with the world. There is a theory in biology called geographic isolation. When a population is divided by a barrier, a mountain, a river, an ocean, the two separated populations evolve in different ways. They develop unique characteristics, They adapt to their specific environments, and when they eventually meet again, the resulting genetic diversity is much greater than if they had remained together. The same principle applies to cultures. Babel was the geographic isolation of humanity, and the resulting diversity is incalculably rich. But here is the tension that defines the post-Babel human condition. We long for the unity we lost. Every empire in history has been an attempt to reunify humanity under a single banner. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Mongols, the British, all of them in different ways, tried to undo Babel through conquest, to force peoples of different languages to submit to a single authority, and all of them eventually failed. Empires fragment, languages survive, cultural identities persist through centuries of oppression. Nimrod himself, according to extra-biblical traditions, did not abandon his dream after the confusion of languages. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century, describes Nimrod as a tyrant who gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God than to bring them into a constant dependence on his own power. Even after Babel, Nimrod tried to maintain control over the fragmented groups. But how do you rule people with whom you cannot communicate? The very tool of his power, the ability to command, persuade, inspire, had been destroyed. Rabbinic texts tell that Nimrod lived to see his empire dissolve. The cities he had built became capitals of independent kingdoms. The peoples he had united separated into hostile nations. The hunter of men became prey to his own ambition. Some traditions say he died in battle against one of these rebel kingdoms. Others claim he was murdered by Esau, Abraham's grandson. What all agree on is that his dream of universal dominion died with him, only to be reborn generation after generation in other tyrants with the same impossible appetite. And this is exactly where the story of Babel connects with the present in a way that few realize, because we are living through a new attempt at unification, not through bricks and bitumen, not through armies and conquest, through technology. The internet connects billions of people who speak thousands of different languages. Automatic translators allow conversations between people who do not share a single word of common vocabulary. Social networks create communities that transcend national borders and linguistic barriers. For the first time since Babel, humanity is gathering in a global collective project, and the parallels are unsettling. Genesis 11:6 records the divine evaluation, and the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." God did not say that a united humanity would do bad things. He said there would be no restriction, no limit, no barrier. And that, the absence of limits, was the problem, because a humanity without limits does not become divine. It becomes monstrous. Look at what modern technology allows: mass surveillance that no ancient empire could dream of. Weapons capable of destroying entire civilizations in minutes. Manipulation of information on a scale that makes the propaganda of the past look amateurish. Artificial intelligence that can generate misinformation faster than humans can verify. A connected humanity is not automatically a redeemed humanity. It is humanity with amplified power, for good and for evil. And here is the question that everyone watching this video needs to confront. What are you building? Not physically, existentially. What is your tower? What is the project in which you invest your life, your energy, your years? Is it a career that is supposed to make your name? Is it a bank account that is supposed to guarantee your security against any catastrophe? Is it an image on social media that is supposed to reach the heavens of human approval? The materials have changed. The motivation remains identical. The builders of Babel were not evil people trying to do evil things. They were scared people trying to protect themselves. They were ambitious people trying to leave a legacy. They were ordinary people doing what seemed rational, joining forces, working hard, building something lasting. And none of that was wrong in itself. The problem was not the tower. It was what the tower represented, the belief that human beings can guarantee their own security, reach the divine by their own effort, conquer immortality through achievements. That is the lie that built Babel, and it is the same lie that builds the towers of today. But there is an alternative, and it appears in the biblical text just 2 chapters after Babel. Genesis 12 introduces a man named Abram, who would later be renamed Abraham. God appears to him and says something that directly contrasts with Babel. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. Did you hear that? I will make your name great. The builders of Babel wanted to make a name for themselves. Abraham received a great name as a gift. The difference is fundamental. Babel was about conquering. Abraham was about receiving. Babel was about climbing up to God. Abraham was about God coming down to man. Babel was about humanity united in rebellion. Abraham was about a family chosen to bless all the families of the earth, including those scattered from Babel. If this reversal is making sense to you, comment Babel and Abraham. Because these 2 paths are still the only options available to humanity. You can try to build your own tower, work harder, accumulate more resources, conquer more status, erect higher walls against the fears that haunt you. And maybe you will succeed. Maybe your tower will look impressive for a few years, a few decades. But eventually, and this is not pessimism, it is physics, entropy wins. The bricks dissolve, the bitumen cracks, the foundations sink. Everything you built becomes a depression in the ground where future archaeologists will dig, trying to understand who you were. Or you can do what Abraham did. Leave. Leave behind the false security of human structures. Follow a voice that promises something you cannot build on your own. Receive a name instead of manufacturing one. Be blessed to bless others instead of accumulating to protect yourself. It is not an easier path. Abraham spent decades living in tents with no land of his own, waiting for promises that would only be fulfilled after his death. But his tents lasted longer than Nimrod's tower. His name is remembered with honor 4,000 years later, and through his offspring, physical and spiritual, all the families of the earth were indeed blessed. There is a final image I want to leave with you. The book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, describes a city, not a city built by human hands, but coming down from heaven, from God. A city with 12 gates, always open, through which people from every nation, tribe, people, and language enter. The languages still exist. The diversity of Babel is not erased, but the barriers have been removed. Distrust has disappeared. Communication flows not because everyone speaks the same language, but because everyone knows the same God. This city has a name, New Jerusalem, and its description is the exact opposite of Babel in every way. Babel was built from the bottom up. New Jerusalem comes down from the top down. Babel was made of bricks that humans molded. New Jerusalem is made of materials that no human hand can create. Gold transparent as glass, pearls the size of gates, foundations of precious stones. Babel had a tower trying to reach heaven. New Jerusalem does not need a tower because the presence of God dwells in it directly. Babel was abandoned and forgotten. New Jerusalem remains forever. But here is the detail that transforms this vision of a distant future into a present decision. The New Jerusalem is not just a destination, it is an identity. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Philippians, declares that our citizenship is in heaven. It won't be. It is present now. Those who belong to Christ are already citizens of that city. Even while they live as foreigners in this world, they do not need to build towers to protect themselves because they already have a city with foundations that cannot be shaken. They do not need to make a name for themselves because they have already received a new name that no one knows except the one who receives it. This does not mean passivity. Abraham built altars, dug wells, negotiated with kings. Christians throughout history have built hospitals, universities, orphanages, social justice movements that transformed civilizations. The difference is not between building and not building. It is between building for yourself and building for God. Between building with bricks of human ambition and building with living stones of faith, hope and love. Between building a tower to reach the heavens and building on the rock that the heavens sent. We began this documentary with a question. How was the Tower of Babel built? The technical answer involved burnt bricks, bitumen from the valley of Siddim, earth ramps, generations of slave labor, primitive but effective engineering. But the deeper answer is another. The Tower of Babel was built with fear, fear of the flood, fear of oblivion, fear of a God who had demonstrated absolute power over creation. And paradoxically, the response to fear created the result that fear tried to avoid. They built so as not to be scattered, and they were scattered. They built to make a name, and their name became synonymous with failure. They built to reach the heavens, and the heavens came down to confuse them. Fear is a terrible architect. It designs defensive structures that become prisons. It erects walls that isolate instead of protecting. It accumulates resources that weigh down instead of sustaining. The Tower of Babel is the eternal monument to what happens when fear directs the project. And every generation since then has repeated the same mistake, with different materials and different names, but with depressingly similar results. But there is another way to build. Not from fear, but from faith. Not to reach God, but because God has already reached you. Not to make a name, but because you have already received one. Not to avoid judgment, but because judgment has already been satisfied elsewhere, on another wooden structure erected on a hill called Calvary. The cross does not look like a tower. It does not impress with its height or engineering. But it connected heaven and earth in a way that millions of bricks never could. If you have come this far in this documentary, you are not here by accident. Something in this story resonated with something in your life. Perhaps you recognize your own tower in the foundations of Babel. Perhaps you are tired of building structures that promise security but deliver only exhaustion. Perhaps you are ready for an alternative. If that is you, comment, "Ready to descend." Because descending from the tower is not defeat. It is the first step toward finding what the tower promised but could never deliver. And that is exactly what thousands of people throughout history have done. They descended, not from physical towers, but from life projects built on the wrong foundations. Augustine of Hippo was a man who had built his tower on pleasures, philosophy, and academic ambition. At 32, he was at the peak of his career as a professor of rhetoric in Milan and completely empty. In his Confessions, he describes the moment he descended. "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." The restlessness was the tower crumbling. The rest came when he stopped building. The same pattern repeats in countless biographies. C.S. Lewis, the most reluctant convert in England, as he described himself, spent decades building an intellectual tower against God. Until one night, alone in his room at Oxford, he knelt and admitted that God was God. Perhaps the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England, he wrote later. But from that reluctance was born a faith that would influence millions through books like the Screwtape Letters and the Chronicles of Narnia. The tower he dismantled gave way to a cathedral of words that still points people to heaven. What these men discovered, and what you can discover today, is that the descent is not the end, it is the beginning. When you stop building your own tower, Your hands are free to receive what God wants to give. When you abandon the project of making a name for yourself, you discover that there is already a name written in the heavens that no confusion of languages can erase. When you give up on reaching the divine by your own effort, you realize that the divine has already come down to you. The story of Babel is not just about the past. It is a mirror. Every time you read it, it reflects something different about your own life. The fear that drove those builders is the same fear that wakes you up at 3 in the morning thinking about bills, relationships, the future, death. The ambition that shaped those bricks is the same ambition that defines your career goals, your dreams of recognition, your hunger to be remembered. The silent rebellion against God that motivated the tower is the same rebellion that whispers, "I know what is best for my life," every time you ignore an inconvenient conviction. But the God of Babel is also the God of today. He still comes down to see what the children of men build. He still cares about structures that lead to destruction. He still intervenes, not to destroy people, but to save them. The confusion of languages was mercy disguised as judgment. It was better to be scattered and frustrated than united and condemned. It was better not to finish the tower than to finish it and discover that the heaven reached was empty of everything that truly matters. And here is the final irony that ends our journey. The builders of Babel wanted to avoid being scattered over the face of the whole earth. God scattered them. But centuries later, Jesus gave a command to his followers: go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. The scattering that was punishment became a mission. The dispersion that was judgment became a divine strategy. The spiritual descendants of Abraham now travel voluntarily to the same places where the descendants of Noah were forced to go. The difference is that they do not go building towers. They go announcing that the tower has already been replaced by a cross. And that cross, that structure so different from the tower, did what Babel never could. It gathered people from every language, tribe and nation, not by eliminating their differences, but by transforming them into harmony. A church in Seoul sings the same gospel as a church in Lagos, as a church in São Paulo, as a church in Moscow. The melodies are different, the languages are different, but the message is one. Babel fragmented humanity in confusion. The cross reunifies humanity in worship. If you have never been part of this reunification, today can be the day. There is no complicated ritual. There is no tower to build or climb. There is only an honest prayer. God, I tried to make my own way. I built my own towers, and all of them are crumbling or have already crumbled. I am coming down. I accept what you offer instead of insisting on what I manufacture. I receive the name you give instead of fighting to make my own. I enter the city that comes down from heaven instead of continuing to build cities that sink into the dust. If you said that prayer genuinely from the depths of a soul that finally admits its bankruptcy, something has changed. Not necessarily your feelings, not necessarily your circumstances, but your citizenship. You now belong to the city that cannot be shaken. You now carry a name that survives death. You are now connected to a community that transcends the barriers of Babel, not because it ignores them, but because it crosses them by the power of the same Spirit that descended at Pentecost. And if you were already part of this community before watching this video, my question is different. What towers are you still building? What parallel projects of self-security compete with your trust in God? What ambitions to make a name for yourself contradict the name you have already received? Because the temptation of Babel does not disappear at conversion. It becomes sophisticated. It disguises itself as ministry, as responsible provision, as wise planning. But the test is always the same. If this structure were removed, would your peace survive? If this achievement never came, would your identity remain intact? If this name you are building were forgotten, would the name written in heaven still be enough? We have covered a lot of territory in this documentary. We traveled from the plain of Shinar to the satellites that photographed its ruins from space. We met Nimrod, the hunter who tried to hunt the sky. We analyzed 4,000-year-old bricks and bitumen that still stains the hands of archaeologists. We witnessed the descent of God and the confusion that followed. We mapped the dispersion of nations and the birth of languages. We connected Babel to Pentecost, Genesis to Revelation, ancient bricks to modern anxieties. But all this knowledge is useless if it does not produce transformation. The story of Babel was not preserved for 4 millennia to satisfy historical curiosity. It was preserved as a warning and as an invitation. The warning is clear. Any human project that tries to reach the heavens by its own strength will end in confusion and ruins. The invitation is equally clear. There is a way that the heavens have opened to the earth, and that way has a name. Jesus Christ, Jacob's ladder, the door of the sheep, the way, the truth, and the life. 4,000 years ago, a crowd worked feverishly on a Mesopotamian plain, molding bricks, mixing bitumen, climbing ramps under a scorching sun, believing that each row brought them closer to the divine. Today, as you watch this screen, the same choice presents itself. You can continue building, mold bricks of career, relationships, achievements, legacy, mix the bitumen of effort and strategy, climb ramps of personal sacrifice toward a heaven that always recedes. Or you can come down, drop the tools, admit that the tower doesn't work, and discover that the God who came down to see Babel also came down to save you. The choice is yours. It always was. But now you know what the builders of Babel did not know. You know how the story ends. Towers fall, the city of God remains. Manufactured names are forgotten. Names given by God last forever. And the God who confused the languages at Babel is the same God who is offering at this very moment clarity about the only thing that really matters, whose you are and where you are going. Thank you for walking with me through this extraordinary story. If it touched your heart, if it enlightened your mind, if it disturbed your conscience in ways you know it needed to be disturbed, share it. Not for me. For someone who is desperately building towers and needs to hear that there is another option. The 70 nations that left Babel needed this message. The 7 billion people who descend from them still do. And if this video impressed you, click on the video that is appearing on your screen right now. I guarantee it will surprise you even more.